Hey, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
Can you hear me okay in here?
I can.
The reason I asked that is we're actually in a brand new studio we just basically built in a wing of our house with some sound deadening panels and everything. So
yeah, no, I think it sounds great.
All right, cool.
Although a wing of our house makes our house sound ginormous.
Well, it is, I call it a wing because it's kind of the space over the garage that our landlords were using for storage. And so we actually said, hey, can we put like a studio office space up there to do some video and audio, and we'll pay you a little extra money a month? And they said yes. So that's what we're doing with this. I guess wing is a big, like the West Wing or something.
No, right? I like it. I think you should keep using the word wing.
Sounds like this epic place.
And we're very, very happy to have this space, to have created a podcasting studio, because for years.
5 years now, I think, right?
For 5 years, we've been, I'm going to use the word wing again, we've been winging it, meaning like we go to different parts of the house and set up shop, and sometimes we have to move depending upon sort of the dynamic of the home. And so to have a dedicated space that we don't have to throw blankets over or anything, like it's soundproofed, and I think we're going to keep adding a little bit to it. Like, I think there's too much echo even for you right now. Even though it's probably the best we've ever had, there's probably even for you just too much echo, but yeah. We'll probably make it even better. But like if we've been a little late with the podcast, we've been working on the studio, and I'm super happy with it.
Yeah, our friends Roy and Christian and Molly helped us this past weekend set up a bunch of stuff. Mm-hmm. And one of the things we also set up, not just this audio studio, it's like a little closet we've retrofitted, right? But the space just outside, we've got a video set, because we want to start doing some more YouTube videos and other style of video content, not just audio content.
Right. So listen for information about a live call-in podcast show that we are about to ramp up and start as well. So I think we're dating ourselves just a little bit with this podcast, because if you're listening to this into the future, maybe that show will already exist and have been in existence for a while. But we're just really, we're like excited. We're like little kids in a toy shop or
it's like
a candy
time
shop.
Capsule.
Yeah, it's like a time capsule. It's like so awesome. So we don't usually do banter at the beginning of our episodes, but I think we're just too excited about it.
Yeah.
It's just like so nice, because we just walked in and sat down and everything was set up, and we didn't have to like retrofit it or set it up or anything. And I was like, oh, I'll never go back. I won't be able to go back now. I'm ruined now.
Yeah, and you listening, I'd love for you to come over to personalhacker.com below this podcast and just leave a little comment. How does it sound? How do you think the sound is? Sound good? You like the quality? Sound too echoey? You're like, what's he talking about? Echo? Reverb? What's going on? Sounds fine to me. Sounds like it's always sounded. I don't know.
Well, I think I've mentioned multiple times that you are very finicky about the sound quality.
I'm fussy.
Yeah, you are fussy. But that's good. I think it's really good, because it ensures that we have good sound quality, because I probably wouldn't be thinking about it as much, even though I'm auditory. I'm way too content focused. And it also ensured that we got this little studio set up, which I'm again, ruined for life. Will not be able to go back to the old arrangement.
Yeah. I think it's my SI, Introverted Sensing Inferior, as an ENFP, that's fussy because I want to future-proof our work. Meaning, like if we're shooting video, I'm like, okay, what's the best format? 5K color space with the highest resolution, and like put everything into it, because I'm like, in the future, 20 years from now, they're going to be watching like all sorts of stuff on like 25K TVs and all this crazy stuff. And so then I'm like, we got to make sure we anchor all this stuff in for the future. It's like distressing to my SI.
That's going to sound like introverted intuition to other people. It's going to sound like NI future pacing.
Well, the stress of it, certainly not.
Well, I think what it is not that you're future pacing what's coming. It's that your fear is that when we get to the future, your SI is going to be upset that it looked into the past. It's like, even when we future pace, when we have SI, we still experience the future looking back on the past and what we did wrong in the past.
And something that Dario Nardi talked about was that introverted sensing over time gets more specific and more like deeper channeled. And probably my extroverted intuition is fearful that our content will be too channeled. It'll be too specific. I have like all these old like 8mm videotapes from childhood, it's difficult to find something to play them on because the formats have changed so much. So my guess is that it's like one of those like unconscious worries that our media that we create will be too specific to interface with whatever technology of the future is there.
Right, and then we'll lose our history.
Right?
Yeah, it's so nuanced, isn't it? It's like these, by the way, are these are the little things that make it sometimes so difficult to type people and type yourself. Because that idea of, I think into the future and I think, oh man, are we going to have high enough quality for whatever's coming in the future? Sounds but it actually is a manifestation of an idealism in your SI inferior.
How does it show up for you with your introverted sensing? When you look, like, do you worry about things in the future like I do? Do you have a sense of, and I know we're getting personal to our experience here.
Yeah.
And it's in the inferior position, but my interest in this is probably useful to somebody that's like an SJ in the Myers-Briggs system, somebody that uses introverted sensing primary, secondary. They probably have a similar, I mean, it's more sophisticated, obviously, but they probably have a similar relationship maybe between their extroverted intuition and their introverted sensing. So I'd love to hear what your thoughts are.
Like, does my SI freak out about the idea that we won't be able to capture our experience right now for review later?
No, because you've already said it doesn't freak out about that. So what does it freak out about? Like, what specific things do you worry about in the future? Like similar to what I worry about. Yeah.
So I think a manifestation of my SI inferior was very much reflected back to me when your let's see, what was his relationship to you? His your grandfather's cousin.
Talking about Melvin?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was my paternal grandfather's first cousin.
Okay, so he had been in World War II. He died a few years ago into his 90s.
No, he was almost 103.
Oh, 103. Was he in World War II or World War I?
He was in World War II.
Okay, World War II.
But he was
that's
older.
Okay, so yeah. Sorry, World War I would have made him like 120.
Yeah, they would take anybody in the war back then. Yeah. If you're an able body, go off and die for a country.
Yeah. So he was 103, and he had been in World War II, and he was an ISFJ. And he had been recording details, kind of like what I imagine. Do you remember that guy in the Elizabethan period named Mr. Pips, who we know as much as we do about the Elizabethan time period because of his copious notes? I think he was a character. He was a character in a movie. I can't remember what the name of the movie was, but I just remember him sitting there just like recording everything that happened around him. And he was an actual historical figure. Well, your grandfather's cousin Melvin may have been an identical type of person. He just recorded everything. Every person who came into his sphere ended up getting a place in his diary. I'm fairly certain he was an ISFJ. Did I already say that?
Yeah.
And so I remember walking into his house after he died, and I mean things that were pristine, like his government issued button bag from World War II was pristinely sitting in a pristine old pharmacist case that just looked beautiful. And it wasn't like he wasn't wealthy, so it wasn't like the things he had were high. I mean, they were high quality because of their age, but he had taken care of them so much. And there was so much history in his house, like newspapers that were reporting on things from the 50s, like original newspapers and that sort of thing. And I remember thinking, like, this entire house should be encased in glass. And I knew that it had to be cannibalized. I knew that because nobody's going to let an old, ranch-style house that's filled with a bunch of what everybody else would consider to be junk. Like, most of that stuff doesn't even need to be in a museum. I mean, there's government-issued button bags from World War II in museums, I'm sure, already. And this is not that big of a deal to anybody. But for me, for some reason, I have this, like, extraordinary reverence for what had been preserved in a way where it actually kind of caused me physical pain, knowing that they were parting it all out to a garage sale and people just come in and being like, I want that and I'm going to throw that away. And I like my whole body just sort of curled in on itself thinking about that. And what's crazy about that is that's not personal to me at all. Like, I mean, the only reason why I know that guy existed is because of a connection he had with my husband as like a distant relative. And yet when I walked into his house, even though nothing was personal to me, I still had a reverence for the history that he had maintained and preserved so well. So I think that's how my SI shows up. It's like when somebody has taken great care to preserve the past, I feel like we should honor that.
Yeah, I remember that day, and I remember actually two things going through my mind. The second one escaped me, but I'll remember the first one now. So he used to keep track of, well, actually the second one actually pivoted into a whole nother conversation. I just realized probably so around introverted sensing. But when we were there, well, both might actually, when we were there and I was watching that happen, because he didn't have any children, his wife had already passed away, so he was the last of anything. It was, some of my family, some like distant relatives there kind of cleaning out his space in order to do this garage sale and get rid of stuff. And I remember thinking, I remember having this very clear introverted sensing moment going, it doesn't matter what I do to preserve things. I mean, even as much as I was freaking out at the beginning of this podcast, like about, audio formats and capturing things, it doesn't matter. Like the moment I die, all that control is in somebody else's hands. And if they decide that I'm not worthy of that for whatever rules they apply to me in the future, like whatever rule they have in the future, that I'm no longer worthy of that, look at the things I produce, it could just be wiped off the planet. Like there's no guarantee that just because I took introverted sensing time to catalog things or capture things or hold on to things, that anyone else will honor that after I'm gone. Like that's personal to me. And that's something that I bet you introverted sensing doesn't realize that it's deeply personal because it's so tied into the social or the structural collective of our world, because our world kind of runs on SI a lot. Like introverted sensing, what we've nicknamed memory, seems to be what drives our world forward. Those procedures, all these things in place. It creates civilization. So we get mixed up and think, that when I preserve all this in my introverted sensing, like the world at large will honor that. We almost assume like there's this metaphysical or like boardroom of people that's going to like, oh, good, thanks for capturing all this. We're going to now take this and we'll be the collective human museum of the things you contributed to the collective. And I realized during that experience when we cleaned out his house, that is not going to be the case when I die.
Yeah, the future is fickle, which is probably why people who have introverted intuition or NI and focus on NI things, they don't have a value for introverted sensing or SI as much.
That's my new hashtag, by the way. The future is fickle.
The future is, it is. People in the future, they're going to have their own values. They're going to have their own, like I think I just recently wrote to somebody in an email, people in the future are going to have their own games of right and wrong. And it may have nothing to do with anything that we care about right now. And so...
Well, 50 years ago, they could never imagine the games we're playing today.
Yeah.
And we're playing games, they'd be like, what? Those are the games you have for right and wrong? And then back then, they were resetting the rules for the things they inherited.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I think another way that my introverted sensing shows up for me is my carefulness around information, especially if it's going to be captured. Like if it's going to be time-bound, like the podcast. There have been many times when I've thought, we should do more podcasts around the Enneagram. And then I think, oh man, I don't know enough about the Enneagram. And what's crazy is that I know more about the Enneagram than most people that I talk to. But I don't have the level of expertise like, when we get Beatrice Chestnut on the podcast or when we talk to her, and her mastery over Enneagram and Enneagram subtypes and my like understanding in comparison and contrast with her, it's not, I feel like I'm just scratching the surface in comparison with her. Of course, she's been teaching it for 25 years. And of course, she's going to have that level of mastery. But when I talk to her, I'm like, oh man, I just don't know enough about the Enneagram. So I shy away from those episodes. I go, I don't think I should really be talking about it because I don't know enough. I was thinking about taking some open course, MIT open coursework or something to that effect on political science and economics because I don't really understand enough. And I started thinking, if I ever wanted to do anything in a political realm, which I don't really have any desire to do, but I'm extroverted intuition. I like to keep my options open, like what's going on in the future. Like it could go anywhere. I remember thinking if for any reason I had to be in a leadership position, I need to have my ducks in a row and understand government inside and out. not that I have any anticipation at all of that happening, but for some reason it just became super important to me. So I started, like I got a copy of I got a copy of the Constitution. And I read it through. And I got a copy of, or like I went through a whole bunch of YouTube videos describing all of the aspects of government and how they work.
U.S. government.
The United States
U.S.
government.
Constitution.
Yeah. U.S. Constitution. U.S. Yeah, exactly. U.S. government. Thank you. And I just started like consuming this information like crazy. And I mean, it's a lot. There's a lot here. I mean, it's an entire, it's an undergrad degree in political science and plus. So there was a lot to it, but I just remember thinking, if I'm ever going to need this information, I should probably gather it now. So there's multiple facets to introverted sensing, and one of them is a capture of like being sort of a steward for information and traditions and the things that should be maintained in cultures and in institutions and that sort of thing. But another component of introverted sensing is a desire for expertise. It's a desire to make sure that you have your ducks in a row so that if you ever are called upon something, you have that information. And that's why introverted sensing has a tendency to give a lot of reverence to people who are experts in their field, because they know that that person has put the time in. And you and I have a friend who's an ISTJ who is almost perpetually in college, even though he runs a 8-figure business. And his life is insanely busy, I'm sure. His business got sued, and he decided, I don't really want to pay lawyers to do this, so I think I'm just going to go get my own law degree. And so he went and got his own law degree, or he's working on it right now. And before that, he just really believes that constantly gathering information and being an expert in different things is the most important thing he can be doing. And I thought, man, that's very introverted sensing of him, because I feel some of that in my inferior function. I don't have a degree in any of the things that we talk about. I don't have a degree, but I feel like I'm autodidactical enough to have gathered information around the things that we talk about so that I feel a level of comfort to share them. And if I don't feel like I have that level of expertise, I'm very clear about it on the podcast. I say things like, I've read this book. I thought it was really intriguing. I'm not an expert on the topic, but blah, 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 blah. And I always feel like I have to bookend with, I'm not an expert on the topic. I think that's something where my introverted sensing really shows up for me too.
I think, so I'm going to say the second thing I was going to say about cleaning out Melvin's house in a minute here.
Yeah,
so I resonate with a lot of what you just said. It's kind of funny that you're worried about information getting captured and I'm worried about things not getting captured.
Right.
We're worried about capturing it or not capturing it. It's about capturing that information or that whatever, but you're like, don't capture it till I'm ready or I have the knowledge. I'm like, let's capture it and like I like to chart kind of along the timeline so I can see my progress. That's one of the reasons why I want to capture it. It's like a weight loss diary or something of my life. Like in a general sense, I get to see where I came from. The more I capture, the more I can review it and see the timeline of where I've come and actually developed and grown and gotten better. I think that's one of the really cool things about that. I have an anecdotal story about the silliness sometimes of introverted sensing. Can I share it? It has nothing to do really, it's not really that valuable, but it's a funny story around these paper trails and paperwork that introverted sensing forces us all the time with.
Yeah, of course.
So when Piper was born, our daughter, in the hospital, I remember like as a new parent, you were a new mom. I had already had 2 kids, but they saw us as brand new parents because it was our first child together. So they come in and like before you go that morning when you're checking out of the hospital, you got to do all this like paperwork. You got to like, name the kid, get the birth certificate signed, like all this paperwork you're doing. And I remember one of the papers that the nurse brought, she's like, okay, and I need to educate you the new parents how to do childcare. And she basically gave us the basics of how to burp a baby and how to nurse and all the basics. And then she had this form and she said, now I want to go over this form here. This form basically indicates that you are going to protect the child and you're going to sign this in good faith that you're going to take the child home and not harm the child. And there's all these different elements on this paper here. And she went through the lines and stuff, I don't remember all the details, but stuff about like, not abusing the child, Piper making sure she's fed, not neglect, like just general things. And you sign this form, like mom and dad sign it at this hospital. I don't know why we did it, but we signed it. It was like, this is their formal thing they do, this paperwork. So the day goes on. Hours later, another nurse comes in, the shift has happened now. and they bring the little car seat thing, and they're getting all this stuff together. Your bags are packed. We're getting ready to like literally put Piper in the car and drive her home for the first day of her, her second day of her life or something. And she's like, okay, just to review really quick, you guys understand how to change diapers? We're like, yeah. She goes through how to nurse. She's like, okay, now what? She's like, let's do a little role playing here. What do you do if the baby is crying and won't stop crying? And I looked at her, and this is a very ENFP thing for me to do. And I'm not proud of it, but this is something we do, and it came to me in the moment. So I know somebody's gonna be like, you can't, like horrified I did this.
I don't think you should not be proud of it. It was hilarious.
I looked at this poor nurse, and I go, you just shake him really hard, right? That gets him to stop crying. And I just like said it very deadpan. And she looks at me like, her eyes get really big, and I think at first she's like processing what I just said, like trying to understand, did he just say you would shake a child to stop it from crying? And instead of saying, sir, that would break the baby's neck, that would, like, she, instead of explaining all the reasons why that would be a bad idea and what it would do to harm the child, all she said to me is, she said, sir, you can't do that. You signed a paper this morning with the other nurse that indicated you would be careful and not do those kind of things. And she was very distressed that I had signed this paper that morning, and I was still talking about doing something to harm this child after I'd signed a paper that I wouldn't do that. And to me, I was just like, what? That blew my mind. I was like, are you kidding me? You're not going to explain to me why that would harm Piper? You're going to explain to me that I signed a paper and that's going to stop me from that behavior? I was blown away. But that's the kind of stuff that as an ENP in the Myers-Briggs system, I go through the world, and that's an acute example of some of the things that we encounter in our lives. And we're kind of baffled that people point to paperwork as if it's this magical thing that makes stuff happen in the world.
Yeah, I think that introverted sensing, that call to authority and signing a paper, like the paperwork that, would be, I think the assumption, okay, I'll just say this, for years afterwards, anytime we made a joke about violence to anybody or anything, we'd look at each other and be like, but you signed a paper. It became
our running joke. Yeah.
It became our running joke. You signed a paper. But I think folded into that statement, which seems so baffling and patently ridiculous to me at the time, because I remember thinking it was really silly too. And I remember thinking you were really, that you were quick-witted when you said, you just shake it, right? That's how you get it to be quiet. And the look of horror in her face, but you signed a paper. I think folded into all of that is actually, you didn't just sign a paper, you read thoroughly. You were given the information on how to treat a child, and you walked through it with the nurse, and you indicated that you understood appropriate behavior towards a baby with the nurse, to a point where you put your signature on the bottom. And so we went through all of this, right? Like, you should know better because we went through all of this just in case you didn't know. So you signed a paper, has all of that woven into it, which is like you went through all of the steps that you should have gone through in order to know that that's, that you would never do that. And the idea that somebody would cop to that, the idea of somebody would articulate that they were going to shake a baby in order to make it, like quiet. I think there are certain people who they're not used to that being a joke.
Well,
right?
I can't tell if she was more upset. Quite frankly, I can't tell if she was more upset about actually shaking a baby, or if she was more upset that the systems that were in place were breaking down.
Well, I think that obviously the systems breaking down is upsetting because a child could be shaken. So at the end of the day, it's about, how you treat a child.
Of course.
Yeah, for sure.
And by the way, I immediately, when I noticed that,
this is not the right audience,
I deadpanned it too much.
Yeah.
And my ENFP kind of like nature, I was like, oh no, this probably ESFJ nurse is taking what I'm saying way too serious. And I need to immediately within 30, you were there, within 30 seconds, I'm like, I'm just kidding. I'm so sorry. I know I signed the paper. I reassured her and said, I actually have 2 other children. I showed her pictures of them, and we laughed a little bit with it. But at first she was just really taken aback. It wasn't our normal nurse either. She didn't know me. She was a brand new person coming in too. So she hadn't gotten around my humor for 2 days either.
Well, and this was also a very small town in Western Pennsylvania. And I noticed that almost all of my deadpan humor fell pretty flat, even culturally. And so I just got to a point where I stopped. I mean, actually, no, to be fair, I didn't get to a point where I stopped joking like that. I just didn't expect a laugh. I was just like, this is just for me. It's not for anybody else. That said, I think it's interesting to come face to face with your inferior function and recognize all the different ways in which it makes a person go, that's not good. But then also recognize all the ways in which we are massively influenced by it. I am shocked by how influenced or how much my inferior function of introverted sensing actually influences me on a regular day-to-day basis, because it's so easy to push it away or not look at it and think, well, that's just, that's so silly. A nurse being upset that you signed a paper, and then her call to authority that you signed the paper and that's why you shouldn't shake a baby. That's so stupid, right? That's idiotic.
Easy to dismiss.
Exactly. And I think that's what sort of defines our relationship with our inferior function is it's so easy to dismiss. And yet at the same time, it sort of jerks our chain on a regular basis. I mean, I have a lot of weird fears around safety. And I don't think I'm a person who is constantly thinking in terms of safety and security or physical safety. That could also go back to my Enneagram type. Like I'm not particularly... I'm not a type that fears for my physical safety a lot. And I've been in a lot of contexts and situations that have made it so that when I was in danger, like it didn't have any long-term harm. So I don't have a lot of physical trauma that would put me in a state where I fear, like that kind of physical harm. It almost always didn't have long-term effects. That said, I do have interesting fears around safety that I know come from my introverted sensing encouraging me to pause. Like that's where I really see my introverted sensing coming up for me, is not just in a reverence for certain things or in a need to have all my ducks in a row informationally, but I also see it as the part of me that encourages me to pause, because my extroverted intuition wants me to be going all the time. Like it's always fascinated by the next thing, and it wants to, it's like it sees life as, those like little, I don't know, they're like those little surprise boxes and eggs and bags for kids, like this massively irresponsible marketing that gets kids to buy crappy little plastic toys because they're a surprise. My opinions on the ethics of all of that aside,
we call it the factory to landfill pipeline.
Yeah, exactly. The factory, exactly. All of that said, to be fair, it's a fantastic metaphor for how I kind of see all of life. All of life is just yet another, and it might even be a disappointing, whatever's in the egg might be disappointing, but I just got to know what's in there. And that's how I feel about all of life. And introverted sensing is the part of me that says, you can do that a lot, but you're going to need to have a home base. You're going to need to have a home to come back to. You need to have some place that... is ultimately, it doesn't change. And it's a place to, to consider like your roots. I also see it as something that doesn't worry about safety in like a normal way. Like it's not like my physical safety all the time, but then there's like these spikes of fear that I have around whether or not I'm going to die. And they're always like very staccato, and they sneak up on me, and it's almost like a paranoia. It's like a weird, interesting paranoia. But one of the ways that introverted sensing really impacts me is every once in a while I get paranoid and I think maybe sometimes people of a similar type this is maybe what we call our, what is that syndrome? We've talked about it on the podcast before, when you don't think that you're qualified to do something, imposter syndrome. This might be a little bit of what influences any moments of imposter syndrome, but we live a very unconventional life. We don't have day jobs, right? We do this. This is what we do. We podcast, we write books, we speak, we teach courses. Like this is our weird life. And every once in a while, my introverted sensing goes, Are we allowed to do this? Like, is this life okay? Because this is not the templatized life. So am I allowed to live this life? Am I doing something wrong because it's so out of beat with the rest of what other people would call reality? Is this okay? Should I be doing this? And what ends up being followed by that thought is my introverted sensing saying, it's okay to do this as long as you have your act together, right? As long as you're working hard and you're not screwing off too much, and, like you really are being diligent and you're really being disciplined, it should be okay. And that's a conversation my little baby introverted sensing has with itself, which is it okay? Are we allowed to do this? Well, only if we're responsible. As long as we're responsible as we do it, it should be all right. And then I move on and I'm not paranoid anymore. So that's like an interesting way that I think it manifests as an inferior function. And then I can't help but extrapolate. Those thoughts are more common to people who have that process higher on their stack.
You also lose words like imposter when you're your introverted sensing can't hold on to like information sometimes. You're like, it's the white thing in the kitchen that holds food, that like, or silver thing that like opens up and you put like, it's cold and
it preserves food for future eating.
I'm like, the refrigerator? And you're like, yeah, the refrigerator. Thank you. I was looking for that word. I'm like, wow, okay. Like, I mean, it's really basic information sometimes you lose.
I misplace basic words all the time.
I think that's your introverted sensing.
You
Probably
think
just
so?
going, where is this again? And like, you're way worse at filing than I am. So in your brain, I'm sure it's just as bad, right?
Yeah, I do. I am pretty
terrible.
bad. I'm pretty bad at filing.
And you're worse than I am.
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
but I think let's pretend that this podcast was supposed to be about introverted sensing from the beginning. And let's talk a little bit, I think, about, I mean, unless you have something that you want to share as well. I mean, because it looked like you were about to say something.
I was going to say my point 2 about cleaning out Melvin's house, but say what you're going to say, and then I'll go into that, because it probably is going to dovetail into some of the things you want to talk about anyway. So just say what you're going to say, and then we'll go to my thing too. We'll get there.
Okay. Yeah, I remember point 2. So I'm actually very curious about point 2 to a point where I've almost lost what I was about to say. But I think what I was going to say is that there are some really beautiful things introverted sensing brings. And we recently did a podcast on why the world needs introverted thinking. And the more I come to appreciate and understand introverted sensing, the more I believe the world desperately needs it. And not just as a representation, not in quantity.
It needs good introverted sensing.
That's right. It needs quality introverted sensing. Just like the world needs quality introverted thinking. And so I do want to talk a little bit about, because we have these funny anecdotes, and especially like we said, it's so easy for us to dismiss it as our inferior function, but there's also beautiful things that quality introverted sensing brings to the world. So I would like to touch on that.
Yeah.
But first I want to hear your second thing about Melvin's house.
So this might dovetail into some of the usefulness for me, or what I've seen for introverted sensing. So when we were in Melvin's house, we were cleaning out, he had the stack of journals that was detailing by the day what he did that day, or what activities in his family or life were happening, like back into his childhood. These were journals. So I went to the day my father was born, who, Melvin, my first cousin, twice removed actually, because my grandfather's first cousin, recorded on March 17th, 1950, when my father was born. Mark was born today, and like recorded this thing about my father being born on this day, because, he was tied with the family at that time. I'm like, wow, he recorded that. He recorded things like when he went to the bathroom, what he did that, all the different activities. He just kept this journal, this daily journal, not how he felt, not what like his impressions were. There was no meaning making from it at all. There was no introverted feeling emotion like into this. There was no like narrative from introverted intuition. There was no extroverted intuition. There's no meaning making. It was just recording what happened. This person was born this day. I went here and did this thing. Just line by line recording what was going on. And I found that very fascinating. So that was something there. And I was literally thinking about this last night. It's really weird. Like you said, we didn't intend to record this today, but in the middle of our first part of the conversation, this entire conversation emerged. So we're going to keep it, obviously. Last night I was thinking about this. I remembered that during my previous marriage, probably about year 3 into my marriage, when things were really bad for me, I, as an ENFP, felt probably the most trapped I've ever felt in my life. I'll probably tell the full story pretty soon here. I think I'm getting really ready to tell my full story. I want to do it in the right way. I felt very trapped. I felt very out of control. I felt very much like I was just kind of going through this carbon copy of every day, just getting through the days. And also I was trying to get my, get things going in my life. So I was still inputting personal growth stuff or just general self-help stuff. And one of the books I was reading, I think was the Everything Time Management book or Time Management for Dummies. And it talked about taking a notebook and tracking what you do for 2 weeks and find out where your time goes. As an ENFP, this resonates with me. I'm like, man, I got to get a hold of my time. So I open this journal, I get a spiral notebook, and I start tracking. Every time I start a new activity, I look at the clock, I write down the time I started that new activity, and then I just put a prompt of what that activity was. So, 8 a.m., ate breakfast. If at 8:15 I got in my car and drove to work, I'd say 8:15 drove to work. When I got to work, sat at my desk, let's say it was like 9 o'clock, I'd say 9 a.m., went through emails at 9:20, bathroom break, 9:30, like down to like bathroom breaks. Grabbed a cup of coffee, 9:47, spoke with Bob about such and such. I like literally tracked every time I started a new activity. I would make an entry of the time and then make a little line of what that activity was.
I appreciate how realistic that is because it's like 20 minutes of work and then immediately a bathroom break and coffee and go talk with Bob.
Yeah. Which, I mean, come on.
That reflects almost every day job I've ever had.
You listening, this is your experience. Like, we all do this, right? We all are like, hey, how soon can I take my coffee break or bathroom break? Yeah, and it was like the thing that keeps you sane, right? So I do this for like 2 weeks. And by the time the week 2 comes around, instead of stopping and reviewing, for some reason, this becomes therapeutic for me. And I don't know why, but I'm now looking back. Last night I was reflecting on this as I was thinking about it. Basically, I was looking at that, and I did this, and I'm not kidding. I'm dead serious. I tracked my life down to not the minute, but probably within 30-minute chunks from the moment I got up in the morning till the time I went to bed. I carried around a spiral notebook, and I stacked up probably 10 to 12 of these, maybe 15 of them, for 1 year. An entire year, I carried a notebook around with me everywhere I went. And recorded every act. Now, some activities have codes on them. Some activities I recorded with code. As an example, if my ex-wife and I had I'll put it in air quotes, conversation, fight, or an argument, I would call that a heavy discussion, and I'd put it in quotes. I would never write fight because I knew she would look at these, and she hated the fact that I was keeping track of this. She hated these notebooks. She absolutely despised them. Partly because I was tracking how many times we fought, probably. And so I would keep track of all of it. So for that year, I have a record of everything I've done, and I never went back and looked through. I have, I think, a few of them. At the time, my ex-wife when we were still together, she was so distressed and was having an episode, she wanted me to destroy all of them. And I think I scanned a few of them and hid some of them before she required me to like get rid of all of them. But anyway, I had them at one point, and I had this entire year recorded. And last night I was thinking about this. I was like, why in the world, as an introverted sensing inferior ENFP, did I spend an entire year of my life tracking down to the minute every activity? And I realized it was probably my version of those movie scenes where you're in a prison cell and the guy takes like a rock or the girl takes a rock and like scratches the day on the wall. And there's like those little marks in like measurements of 5 for how many days they're in that prison cell. I think looking back on it now, that experience I had was me basically doing that in my life. I was marking off time because I wasn't able to access my extroverted intuition. I wasn't able to access everything was unavailable to me, all my skills, all my positive attributes. And so I had to fall back into my introverted sensing in a very bad space in my life. And all I could do is track. I could just track what was going on. And that's it. I couldn't actually solve problems or get in there and pattern recognize yet. All that was not available to me because of my relationship and some other factors. I just shut all that off on behalf of somebody else. I ended up in my inferior for a very long time. And I thought that was very interesting. And I don't know if that dovetails directly into what you want to talk about around introverted sensing, but I think this is it probably can be a useful thing if you are an ENP or an INP even, to have that introverted sensing in the back seat. There might be tools and ways you can manage that, kind of like I did, just stumbled into it. So as we unfold this, I think that's something I just wanted to mention that made me think of as the number 2 from Melvin, because I'm sure if you're listening, you were tracking those 2 things.
That sounds horrifying to me.
Yeah. Actually, it was therapeutic. I liked it. I got addicted to it.
Well, it's not the act that sounds horrifying. It's the life circumstances that I would have to imagine myself being in to make that a survival tactic. That's actually what's horrifying. The thing itself is what I admired about Melvin.
You know what life circumstances I was in.
No, I know, which is why it's horrifying. But Melvin did that his whole life.
Yeah. That's basically what he did every day from the time he could write.
Yeah, and it's amazing to me. And I think, my horror at your life circumstances aside, the activity itself is what I admire so much about introverted sensing, is its understanding of through time. This concept of that time builds on itself, and that it is important to understand it and to record it and to get a concept of, what it means to be through time. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges I've had, is this idea of charting progress. I oftentimes have to sort of sit there and go, have I made any progress? Like, am I doing better? Am I regressing? I almost don't even have a way to mark the passage of time in my mind. And especially since I grew up in a context in a religion where almost every day was like every other day. It was very Groundhog's Day. And so my introverted sensing sort of got into this rhythm of, well, every day is going to be pretty much, or it wasn't actually every day, it was every week. That's actually closer to what it was. Every week was a carbon copy of the week before, and the next week was going to be a carbon copy of it as well. So the weeks just bled together. And so I got out of the habit of tracking things because my context tracked it for me by replicating itself over and over and over again, which I actually don't think is particularly healthy. I mean, I think it's healthy as introverted sensing or SI to get into a routine and a rhythm. I think that's really good. And in fact, anybody who has introverted sensing in their stack really actually should be, if they can't create a routine, they at least can create a ritual. And so it can go either direction depending upon the person and the type and what they need. Routine, ritual, whatever it is, as long as there's that rhythm. And I think introverted sensing is good at helping create a rhythm of, needing to do the same things over and over again. That's part of its superpower, is its ability to sustain sameness over long courses of time for the better, because I think we all have those rhythms. I almost think of them as sort of circadian rhythms for waking life as well as for a sleep life. Like, we all have rhythms inside of our bodies that respond to things that are permanent, or at least permanent fixtures in our world. The sun goes up, the sun goes down. These things that happen around time create these rhythms inside of our bodies. And I think introverted sensing is very good at understanding the importance of those rhythms and getting into those rhythms. I'm really bad at that. In fact, I fight it tooth and nail unconsciously and unintentionally because, of course, SI is my inferior function, or my 3-year-old. And so I have a tendency to not really want those rhythms. And then when I get into those rhythms, they're not particularly productive. It's like me sitting around doing nothing effectively. And I'll get into these modes of either hyperactivity, or I'm just not doing anything. And both of those rhythms aren't particularly healthy. So this idea of pacing, I think, is very important with anybody who's got introverted sensing. This concept of pacing, I think, is either, if the higher up it is in your stack or in your car model, the more likely you are going to have an intrinsic understanding of that pacing. And the further down it is, the more you're going to have to integrate the importance of that pacing, I think. But I think what I admire so much about introverted sensing is that it really does, because it has this concept of through time, and because it has this concept of the importance of these rhythms, and because it's so good at recording, it is such an amazing steward of the past. And I didn't used to have an appreciation of how important that was until I started realizing that the internet, being raised around the internet, which I wasn't. I was mid-late teens when the internet really became a huge thing, probably late teens. And I was in my 20s when it exploded. And of course, it had always existed. I remember my brother logging onto the internet in the 80s, but that was a really kind of anomalous thing. But because we are in a time period, I was able to see the world before the internet and after the internet became a huge, basically it's become life. Being connected on the level that we are, it's become basically life. And we have become novelty obsessed because of it, because it gives us access not only to intangibles like data, information, people, relationships, that sort of thing, but also tangible things like products that we can almost instantaneously get from the internet through Amazon, and it'll be delivered tomorrow.
We'll be able to print them soon.
3D printers. Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of people who have 3D printers and immediately print the items that they want. So because it gives us access to whatever we want almost instantaneously, we have become obsessed with novelty. And as a person who uses extroverted intuition, I'm a novelty person. I love novelty, but it's starting to scare me, quite frankly. Like our obsession with novelty, our obsession with instantaneous access to new things is, I can see it's unhealthy. It's like an unhealthy addiction that we have, our addiction to novelty. And it started to scare me because I'm noticing how younger people are really untethered from history. And not only untethered from history, but demonizing history. I think in part because, history is written by the victors, and so there's going to be bias there. But there's no such thing as an unbiased accounting of history, even within your own life. Like every time you go back and review a memory, you are altering it in some way. In fact, that's actually how extroverted intuition, or NE, influences introverted sensing. You go back and review a memory and you actually see different things and new things and form new patterns in those memories from your review.
My friend Owen, who I think is in ENTP, says every recall is a reframe.
Right, exactly. So every time you go back and think of these things, like you are altering, like history gets altered. So there's no such thing as an unbiased account, but that doesn't mean that we throw the baby out with the bathwater. It doesn't mean that we don't have a sense of history and tradition in the things that have come before. And the moment that really catalyzes this for me in my mind is my favorite ride at Disney World is in Epcot. It's in the geodesic dome, and it's called Spaceship Earth. So if you've ever ridden it, it's a history of communication over time. It starts with like basically writing, carving things into the walls of caves, all the way up to the modern age of the invention of, the personal computer and the internet. And there's a moment you go by, and it's Judi Dench, who currently is the person who narrates it inside your little car. And she talks about the burning of the Library of Alexandria. And then she mentions, but some of these had backups. And she says, the books are saved. And I'm like, oh, no. Some of those books were saved. But a huge amount of human history and learning were destroyed in that fire, in the sacking of that library. It wasn't just a fire. It was like an intentional destruction of that library. And I have on multiple occasions thought, how much further along would we be technologically if that library hadn't been sacked? And so it's hard to understate the importance of time binding. It's hard to understate the importance of capturing information in order to be able to pass it on to the next generation. And the challenge that we have is we believe that because we have access to the internet, that somehow we have made it so that we don't need to bind information anymore because it's all just perpetually bound. And we get to have access to information at any given time. But there's a difference between like passing information from a generation to the next generation than just simply having access to information and data. And that is that the people who are these stewards of the information that they pass to next generation also are able to pass with it a sense of reverence and importance and narration and all the things. The more I think about it, the more I go back to the DIKW model, data, information, knowledge, wisdom, which we've done podcasts on, which is that when you're transferring this information from one generation to the next, you get the benefit of all of their knowledge and wisdom wrapped up into it as they hand it to you. So you don't just have data and information. You don't just have novelty and newness infused into your mind. You also get all of that person's experience with that data and information that they can at least impart to you in some way, so that as you are yourself moving through the world using this data and information, you can know whether or not you're on the right trail, right? You're on the right track because you remember all of the discipline that they handed to you.
I think there's a lot of people that would... I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but...
No, I'm totally on a diatribe, so
before
please
I give you dissent, let me let you finish your thought.
No, well, I mean, and we can talk about this obviously with some dissent, but I think just to wrap up the point, and I am definitely on a monologue, so my apologies, but there is an importance to that transfer of information.
I agree with you.
That includes all of that experience and knowledge and wisdom.
Yeah.
Which we don't get in a novelty world. We don't know, most of what we have given to us, we don't know what to do with. Like, I've noticed that the more connected and the bigger the internet gets, the fewer websites I visit. Like, I probably visit 10 websites on a regular basis, right? And half of them are social media, which in and of itself indicates that we are definitely going more towards relationships. Even when it comes to social media, we're going more towards relationships than we are to information and data.
So more channels, there's less to watch.
Yeah, exactly. It's almost like you get overwhelmed. So we've got all of this novelty. We don't necessarily have context for it. We don't really know how to apply it. And then when somebody tries to introduce history to us, we're not interested. We're like, well, I can look that up at any time, right? I see this in Gettysburg. We live in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, a place of extraordinary history, game-changing American history, possibly one of the most crucial, important bedrock, historical places in the country. And it
altered the course of the world.
Yeah, it really honestly
did.
Those
3 days in 1863.
Absolutely, because of how it, like the influence that America had over the rest of countries, for good or for bad, is in part, based on our relationship to slavery and our relationship to, whether or not we're going to be a unified federation, or whether or not we're going to be stratified states. Like, so much was established there. And people will come visit us and we'll be like, hey, do you want us to drive you around, the battlefield? Because it's beautiful, it's cinematic, and it's got all this history. And they'll be like, not really. I'm like, really? You have no interest in it? I remember driving around with somebody. I think I probably mentioned this in the podcast before. We drove around with somebody who was in her 20s, and she stayed on her phone the whole time and was just looking at her phone the whole time as we were driving around these incredible, historical, a place of extraordinary historical significance. And I know there are arguments against it, why it wouldn't be important, but I don't buy it. My introverted sensing, the more I understand the importance of introverted sensing, the more I don't buy any of those arguments. I think these things are extraordinarily important to hand down and to memorialize. The area around us it's a beautiful place of introverted sensing memorialization, with all of the, not just the plaques, but all of the monuments and art and buildings, and I mean, it's really spectacular. And it helps us live history in a way that just reading about it or even watching a documentary wouldn't do. So to me, introverted sensing is part of how we don't repeat our past failures. It's how we get knowledge and wisdom. If we didn't have memories, we wouldn't be human. Part of being human is the fact that we are a stack of our own personal memories and experiences. So I think really good introverted sensing can't be understated how important it is, and how much we need it.
I think the information of history is told through memories. I mean, we only know about the Civil War because of people that remembered it and wrote it down, and they were using their own personal introverted sensing. Or, I mean, I'm overgeneralizing. Maybe they were another type, obviously, but if you're looking at the introverted sensing in an abstract way, there is a narrative that comes with information when it's passed. And the dissent I was going to give you is not dissent for me. I actually agree with you. I think we miss something when I was reading an article this morning about how a lot of young people, and this really appeals to me, are getting rid of all their worldly possessions. Like in California right now on the beaches, near Venice Beach. Very well-to-do. They have full-time jobs, but a lot of young people, millennial, maybe 20-somethings, are renting a cot, not owning anything, and just using Uber and all of the systems around them. They're renting or subscribing or borrowing or utilizing public space, and they're renting a very small personal space. I love that concept. I think it's great because now you don't have to own everything, right? You don't have to own it all to experience it. You can experience it out there, and you can be more free and more lightweight and have a lot more opportunity and favor experiences over ownership. And I think that we almost see information or history as in terms of ownership. We almost see it as, well, whoever wrote that before owns that information and that history. So because it was written for by people that I don't agree with their narrative, it is laden with narrative. And they're right. Information history, that introverted sensing is laden with narrative. And so it's difficult to separate those two things out. They come together often. And if we buy the history, we have to buy the narrative in a lot of people's minds. And so in order to get away from that, they just want to distance themselves from history altogether. Because they don't want some of those narratives that hook that history up might not be what's applicable today. And that is a little distressing to me, is that old ways of seeing things aren't even passed on, not because we want to honor them, but because we need to have them represented so we don't repeat them. As far as I'm concerned, like let's say certain ways of seeing the world that we've learned from history are bad ways of seeing the world. Like people using ideologies to slaughter people. I don't care what the idea. I'm sure whoever you're listening right now probably imagining the ideology that you don't agree with, but I'm actually lumping them all together. And they can hurt people, slaughter people, and then you don't want to even have that ideology represented because now, oh no, that's a bad ideology, and the history of that, we got to distance ourselves from it. I think that's dangerous.
Well, I mean, that goes back to that concept of every recall is a reframe, which is that we get the benefit of combing through history and seeing patterns that maybe got missed the first time through, but we still have to have the history to recall. So I agree with you. I think it's dangerous without it.
Oh, and it's this idea of owning. You have ownership of the history you're passing, and I think that just having data online, it's almost like those kids, those 20-somethings that don't want to own anything. They just want to access it. I like that idea. I don't know if that works as well with history and information, introverted sensing. I think introverted sensing, well, it's introverted. It's something that it goes inside of you. It's part of who you absorb it into your essence and reflect on that over time. I know we're conflating a lot of things. I'm not saying introverted sensing is history. Please don't mistake that. But I'm just saying, I think it's a personal experience. We experience sensations. We introvert those things. We capture them and process them over time. That's how we feel through it. It's something that happens with us inside of ourselves. And I think that's where to me, it feels like introverted sensing is under attack, quite frankly, in our modern world in a lot of ways. And here I am an ENFP defending the need for introverted sensing. Like, how ridiculous is that? I should be out there attacking it myself because it's my inferior, right? Like, how dare, but yet I'm looking going, I don't know, guys, this looks like we're coming at this, and I'm not sure that's going to go well for us if we throw all the things we've learned. We have introverted sensing knowledge that vaccinating your children saves lives. And for some reason, that information, we're saying, we just want to ignore that introverted sensing information. And now we have mass outbreaks of disease around the world because of this. And it's like, you can't throw introverted sensing out. Bad things happen. You've got to take that knowledge and help pass it on to the next generation.
Well, the reason why people have the ability to say vaccinations aren't necessary is because they don't have a memory of anybody having polio.
Correct.
And so if people
it's not personal,
remembered,
right?
yeah,
it's
not
just
personal.
a piece of data floating out there. 100 years ago, or 50 years ago, people were dying of polio, whatever.
Exactly. And so, and when you mentioned that you didn't want to conflate history with introverted sensing, immediately I thought, well, art isn't introverted feeling, but we understand and express and pass art a lot of times with our introverted feeling function, even if we're not an FP or have it in our stack or in our car model. So history is kind of similar with introverted sensing. History is not introverted sensing, but a lot of times we understand it by understanding our own histories, by understanding our own experience with introverted sensing, regardless of our type. So they're not conflated together, but in some ways we understand it through those lenses.
I'm thinking about this, the whole thing about vaccination I just said. I don't want to name any other ideologies real quick because it's not about a specific ideology, because we're going to get a bunch of anti-vaxxer people that are like, what are you talking about? Blah, 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 whatever their reasons are. So I don't want to name any of their ideologies, but I just realized there's a bunch of ideologies that we fought a bunch of wars over like 100 years ago that are already surfacing again. And I'm like, maybe not 100 years ago, like 90 years ago or 80 years ago. Like the whole planet fought about this stuff. And all of a sudden these ideologies are back on the scene again. And I'm looking around going, what? And what you just said is the reason why nobody vaccinates is because they can't remember polio. Well, nobody remembers World War II either because nobody's alive, from that time period. anymore. Maybe there's somebody that's super old, but like very few people are alive that remember what that was like, have direct experience with it. And it really begs a question in my mind, can we even pass information beyond a generation or two of experience? Because we have every modern historical, informational capture and sharing and distribution device available to us. And we got kids eating Tide Pods, right? And I'm like, what is wrong with this picture? Like we know like so much that we didn't know before on a global scale, interconnected in real time. And we have people not vaccinating their kids, eating Tide Pods and resurrecting old ideologies that we thought we put to bed almost 100 years ago. And I think we're all looking around going, what is wrong with this picture? Like, where did that, like, without the direct experience of introverted sensing, is it even possible to time bind something over a period of time and not have it disintegrate?
That's a really good question. I don't know the answer to that, but it does seem like we are, as a species, we are moving like in spiral dynamics, you'd say up the spiral. So I think in some ways we are able to encode some of those learnings, even sometimes genetically.
Well, ancient societies did have an oral or ceremonial or ritual tradition, of taking the young people out in the woods and teaching them the ways of being an adult, or initiation rites of passage that were the same probably for thousands of years in their tribes or their cultures, because it was embodied introvert sensing, pass this body of knowledge and experience onto the next generation together as a collective. And we have none of that anymore. We don't have very many rituals or societal like rites of passage that people go through. I mean, besides like getting your driver's license or your first period or something. But other than some of these like incidental, there's no like unified front among society initiating our youth into the next introverted sensing body of knowledge.
Yeah.
But we have seen societies that did do this. It's just ours hasn't been able to do it very well.
Yeah, we're not good at encoding information. I mean, we're good at having information, but not encoding it and really integrating it. And I agree. I think rites of passage is, I personally think that we should reestablish rites of passage. I think it's super important for both men and women for, becoming whatever is the thing that lets you know that you are officially an adult and not being able to get drunk at 21, like something better than that, that tells you that you are now, like you're expected now to be a contributing member of society. And I think that we are at a loss when we don't have these, what I would say are really beautiful expressions of introverted sensing.
As we're talking, I think introverted sensing is very needed. The world needs it. I believe it's somewhat under attack, but it's subversively under attack. And it feels like any attempts to have that direct passage is threatened in some ways. I think we see a lot of cultural things being torn out and not allowed to happen because of I'm not sure why it's under attack. I don't know why people don't like it so much, but.
Well, one thing that introverted sensing is very good at is getting used to the context that it experiences on a daily basis. Like introverted sensing is used to acclimation, or it's good at acclimating. And one of the things that I think even SJs are doing right now, or at least being raised, is in a time period of novelty. So it's acclimating to a culture that doesn't honor it. It's acclimating to a culture that expects everybody to be actually in a more extroverted intuition space, a more novelty, addicted place that requires them to be so much more creative on the spot and come up with creative solutions and
Jack of all trades
and do everything and
6 jobs.
Yeah, exactly. And have a ton of partners and everything is going towards a place of novelty, which, I mean, as a person who leads with extroverted intuition, my NE loves novelty. So I understand why that would be exciting to the world, but every function needs its polarity opposite as a ballast. And if we get too much into an extroverted intuition space of just pure addiction to novelty, we don't have our introverted sensing ballast, and it's really unhealthy.
So what do you think? How do you think introverted sensing is showing up in your life, in your sphere, in the world at large? Where do you think it would be needed? Where do you think we need to kill it off and not allow it to show up? Do you think it's a good idea that introverted sensing, do you kind of agree with the idea that introverted sensing has to have almost an embodied passing on of information, like a around the campfire tribal experience of passing on a rite of passage to the next generation? Or can it be time bound somehow digitally, online, distant from us, away from our embodied experience? Like what's your relationship with introverted sensing? We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to hear your story, your questions, your comments. Come over to personalityhacker.com. Directly below this show, you can leave your story and let us know what your thoughts are on this topic.
And if you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. If you leave us a rating and review, that's a kindness that you do for us, and we'd be very appreciative. And also, our book is available, Personality Hacker. You can get it on Amazon, Books A Million, all the other places where they sell books, Barnes & Noble.
Ever-shrinking list.
The ever-shrinking list of places that you can get it. And of course, if you buy it from an independent bookseller, it might not be stocked, but if you request it through them, they'll order it for you, and you can support local businesses and independent bookstores. But all of that said, buy the book. And I say that because I was really nervous about how it would be received, but we are getting great ratings on Amazon, on Goodreads, to a point where I'm starting to believe in the thing. So go get yourself a copy, because I think it really moves the needle for a lot of people, and it's an excellent book.
It is a good book. You need to have it on your shelf. So go get that now. Come over to personalhacker.com. Follow us where you need to on social media. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we will talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.